Я запрошую до слова нашого польського колегу Іренєуша Садовського, який виступить з доповіддю на тему «Плинність політичного класу» на прикладі саме нашої країни, на прикладі України. Іренєуш, the floor is yours.
Yeah, just I'm waiting for my presentation. I hope it will be up in a moment. First of all, добрий день. Thank you for having me. This is a wonderful campus and a wonderful hall. Well, I'm going to have a presentation which might seem a bit risky business because I'm going to discuss Ukrainian politics before the audience that consists of Ukrainian scholars and Ukrainian students. So in a way you can say that you are the experts in Ukrainian politics because you observe it on a day-to-day basis, while I will try to look at this from the perspective of empirical data that was gathered in one of the international projects. Thanks. That will help a lot. Well, I'm going to discuss. Okay, yeah, it works. It's great. Where do I have a pointer here? Which one is the pointer?
The pointer is...
Yeah. Thanks a lot. So what do I mean by fluidity of political class? This is the more general problem which applies to many countries in the world. But I'll use a national case of Ukraine, which in many respects is very interesting. Scholars in political studies often focus on the level of party systems, and they often treat parties and party system as a basic unit of analysis. But in terms of James Coleman, you can say that this is a kind of surface of politics, while there is a lot of going on under the surface. There is a lot of processes and things that boil underneath. And those processes, in case of politics, is what do single individual politicians do? What are their decisions? In what degree they are attached to the party vessels, and so on. So today, speaking about fluidity, I'm not going to simply say about how volatile is the party system, but I'm going to speak about what are the decisions and flows between parties in terms of individual politicians. My research agenda is as follows. I pose two questions which can be posed only in a certain context. And Ukrainian transition from communist times is unique in terms of at least two factors. First of all, the transition is probably the most turbulent in Central and Eastern Europe, because apart from gaining independence, this country experienced two revolutions at two moments. At the same time, it has a war in the east of the country. And this is another very important factor, there was actually constant flux of electoral rules. Since 1990, there are no parliamentary elections that can be directly compared to each other, even being the consecutive ones. So my research questions, first of all, address the issue of how the revolution how the revolutions impacted the fluidity of political class. And the second question is how the changes in the electoral rules influence what do politicians do and how they decide on their attachment, how loyal are they toward their party vessels. So you can look at the 25 years of Ukrainian transition in a way as an experimental design, where you have pretty much the same context, I mean pretty much the same people in terms of, I mean the political class is throughout the period in large degree the same. There is an obvious circulation of elites, but this is still more comparable between terms than comparing different countries, because there is a lot of changing context in such instances. While at the same time you have factors of which I've already mentioned, that are the popular upheavals that are branded revolutions, and one should expect that the revolution, what should revolution bring, is the large replacement in the ranks of politicians, right? So this is basically one of the definitions of revolution, that you not only have the change of a main person in power like king or emperor or president, but also you have the large degree of change in the whole ranks of administration and politics, like it was in French Revolution or Bolshevik revolutions and so on. And we can be curious in what degree did it happen after the Orange Revolution and after the Revolution of Dignity. And the second thing is, and it's nonetheless interesting, is how the fluent electoral rules, how did the politicians reacted to the changing electoral rules by, for example, being more or less loyal toward political parties. Because if we speak about fluidity of political class and constant change on the party scene in terms of labels and affiliations, then we should consider how much mobility there is between parties and between going from example, from being independent candidate to being a party candidate and vice versa. So I said that there are practically no two elections in Ukraine in post-independent period that are directly comparable. And why is that? Even if you have the same electoral system twice in a row, then like in 2002 and 2006 and 2012 and 2014, one of those elections were the snap elections, the preterm elections, which meant that there was little time for politicians to make decisions about their mutual assertment with political parties. Therefore, there were, for example, much less candidates in those snap elections. And what is very convenient for analysis of this kind is that in Ukraine you practically have all kinds of major electoral systems, of voting rules. First of all, you had a majoritarian system with single mandate districts. You had the proportional system in 2000s, and for the most of the time the mixed system was in place. Additionally, the 1990 elections were held in a not strictly democratic manner. It was, you can say that there were last elections in a communist style, though the MPs elected at that moment, the deputies, came to be the first Werchowna Rada pierwszego sklikania. So in a way this was a first parliament of independent Ukraine, but still elected according to the rules of the old regime. That's why we have a lot of interesting variables, and you can analyze the stability of political class, having them as a specific institutional context. Now, I'm going to look at politics in a two-tier manner by treating the ties between politicians and parties, so the processes of selection and recruitment as a first level. You can say that this is a kind of supply side of politics, while the vote itself can be treated as a demand side of the politics, because in popular vote people choose from among the propositions, the offers made by politicians and political parties. And as far as the literature on the subject goes, you can formulate some hypotheses. First of all, the political consequences of what I would say are the free revolutions, because although the independence referendum was quite consensual, it is a quite profound change in functioning of nation states. So in a way, this was the first founding moment for Ukrainian nation state. But in fact, you have to look at Ukrainians gaining sovereignty as a process, rather, at least in several stages, with those revolutions playing important part in this process. That's why we can speak about those three key moments to shaping of how the Ukrainian polity works. And those revolutions got mixed reviews in the literature, scientific literature, and they say that there was a lot of expectations about how deep will be the change in terms of both institutions and political class, and at least in case of Orange Revolution it wasn't as deep as many people expected. And we can pose similar questions in the context of the fallout of Euromaidan. And the question on the consequences of having one voting system or another is that there is a very strong theoretical argument in terms of accountability. Accountability is another way of framing the question of populism. Populism has, as I've already said, a lot of different definitions, and some say that this is a way of approaching the responsibility of politicians for what they promise. But the more precise and scientifically more valid way to pose this question is to frame it as a question of accountability. And you can approach this in several manners, but in theory, Popper's theory, in the writings of Liebhardt and Pipanoris, you find a classical argument which says that there is a more accountability with single mandate districts, because it leads to a dependence of politicians on voting in their constituencies. But this classical thesis is contradicted in more recent research, because when you look at politics at large, then the matter is more complicated, because you have at least two levels of two levels of accountability, of being responsible for policies. First is the accountability of parties which sponsor certain policies, and another thing is accountability of individual politicians, which can switch parties. And for example, if you have a politician in one party, then after a few years he runs from the list of another party, then it's not clear if he is responsible for the politics, because the responsibility is either placed with party or with politicians. So when you have a lot of mixing in the political class, then it's much harder to achieve accountability in the classic sense. The empirical evidence gathered in different countries is not fully consistent. And actually, the argument for Central and Eastern Europe says that there is actually a lot of interaction between formal rules, so having one electoral system or another, with informal rules, so how the politics is actually run in a particular country. Now, to analyze all those issues, I'm going to use the large ISTPAC data set. This is the Eastern European data on parliamentarians and candidates. It was gathered by Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, Polish Academy of Sciences, and the team was headed by Joshua Dubrow, while for the Ukraine, the main responsible person for gathering Ukrainian data was Natalia Pochorila from Lvov. And this data set consists of more than 35,000 Ukrainian politicians which have at least once participated in elections since 1990. This is almost all candidates in parliamentary elections. So we have almost all people throughout the 24-year period. The data is matched over time, which means that we know, for example, that this was the same person running in one elections and then, for example, running in another or resigning altogether from competing. And there is a lot of additional variables like demographics and affiliation and occupation. What's important is the outcome variable. There are two outcomes for each political spell, for each term of the parliament. And this is a variable which says if the politicians continued to compete in elections and retained his affiliation, then the second option was to stay in politics but switch the affiliation, and the third option was resign from running. So looking at those three types of outcomes, we can measure how much fluidity was there in Ukrainian politics in terms of individual runs. I'm more interested in switching parties than in winning a mandate, because winning a mandate is consistent on is dependent on many other factors, and as you will see, changing party by a politician is in many ways similar to what decision all the candidates take. What is more, there is a problem with comparing all the periods of functioning of Ukrainian parliament, because for some time there was an imperative mandate introduced, and it was actually reintroduced. So it's a rule that is in place at the moment too. The most basic result that we can look at is how many people, and I treat it as a panel data because I have the same politicians often in consecutive elections, we can look at how many people, how many politicians decided to retain affiliation in this row. The average for all the interelectoral spells is almost 50%, that are people that stay in politics and were loyal to their parties. About 6.3% on average, these are the people who switched affiliation. And this is very important to understand that we treated switching affiliation in very safe manner. If someone, for example, changed the party label as a consequence of splitting or merging parties, we didn't treat it as changing party. For example, if someone was in Nationalny Ruch Ukrainy and then joined Nasza Ukraina, we didn't treat it as changing affiliation. Only if there was an individual move from politicians to switch party, we treated this as switching. So this is very conservative estimate. Now, most of change in political class happened simply because people competed once in the elections and then went out of politics. Many of them are often branded by the newspapers as, for example, as technical candidacies, people who simply are put on the list but didn't have, for example, very serious plans about and very serious chances of getting into the parliament. Throughout this period, the number of candidates in each elections in Ukraine changed. The highest number of candidates being in 2006 elections, more than 7,000. The number is quite low for 1990 because, as I've already said, there was no full political pluralism at the moment. But what is surprising in this data, that in the periods where we have a popular upheaval revolution, you don't see the much higher than average levels of dropping out and switching. And why is this surprising? My main hypothesis was that during the revolution, people often drop out of politics, or they try to stay in politics by changing their party colors, by changing the banners. What in fact we see is that in both elections that came after the revolutions, the statistics for resigning from politics or for switching are not outstanding. They are very similar to those in other spells. So actually you don't see much change in terms of fallout of very turbulent events in the political timeline. So perhaps there are other important processes that are hidden within this data. First of all, I would like to illustrate what was the fluidity of political class in Ukraine by this relatively simple graph showing you the main political vessels and what were the inflows and outflows in those categories. I treat the independency as a separate affiliation because I treat it as an important decision to not run as a part of some electoral bloc or as a member of a political party. And some of those people were joining or leaving parties throughout the time. So, and one more thing. For example, all the nodes for some parties are named the same throughout the period, though there were obviously changes in the labels. For example, at some moments it would be valid to say that this is a Batkivchina party, not a Yulia Tymoshenko bloc. But to remain, to add the coherence to our coding, I use the same label throughout this time. In some cases, the party system have experienced what one should call party split, like going from, for United Ukraine, the Zajedino Ukraino, to two blocks, Lithuanian blocks and Party of Regions, because you had two very wide flows of politicians from one vessel to another. In some other cases, like here, you have a merger, you have two separate parties that later on competed as one entity. So the main observation here is that for a long time there was a lot of movement between blocks and parties. Often they've crossed as far as going from the left side of the political spectrum to the right side, though those instances are obviously not quite often. And what you see here, that after 1990 elections, and the only political labels that we can apply to this moment is whether people were a member of CPU or not members of CPU, then there was a lot of people that went from CPU to being an independent candidates. They were called often branded later on as party of power or politicians that were actually representing, for example, presidential administration. And those candidates later on, the category of independent politicians became slimmer in later elections, as many of them tried to join some of the most popular parties. Then between 2002 and 2006, the electoral rules were changed, so all the independents were forced to choose some kind of a party. So most of them tried to start their own party, the smaller parties, but a lot joined, for example, Tymoshenko bloc, Litvin's bloc, or Party of Regions. And later on, after this, after the electoral rules were changed again, a lot of people once again went from those parties to being independent candidates. But this label should be, in the light of this data, it should be treated as a separate kind of affiliation. And what might be most interesting is what you see in the last elections, as a lot of people after the revolution try to stay in politics. For example, for those members, for the members of the Party of Regions, most of them tried to run as independents. Many of them joined the opposition bloc. So opposition bloc can be treated as a way of continuation of the Party of Regions. But some of them also went to represent other smaller parties which haven't been as successful as others. What else can you see here is that the parties on extreme right and on extreme left are, one would say, they are not as engaged in this inter-party movement. They are, in fact, create a lot of more closed political groups than those closer to the center. Now, I'm going to present results of statistical analysis that takes into account a lot of different factors to show what is most crucial for politicians to stay loyal to their party or to switch the parties altogether. First of all, the first model is the simplest one. Those are the simple logistic models which take into account first very small group of variables, only the timeline of elections. So what we see here, and this is basically the same what I've shown you in the last in the first table, is that we had the highest amount of switching between 1990 and 1994. So this was the large reshuffling of political class at the beginning of existing of Ukrainian party system. What we see here as well is, as I've already told you, that those both revolutionary moments result in what we would say average rates of switching, because the higher rates were encountered both in 98 and 2002, while in 2007 and 2012 the party switching was much less popular. But one can ask himself a question whether those differences are in large part caused by some individual factors that and perhaps those correlations that we see here are the effects of the fact that at some moments you had the population of candidates that consists of people of quite different characteristics. So adding the candidates' personal traits allows us to say whether the switching itself was caused by individual traits or by the general political events happening in the country. And this is our second model. You have a odds ratio, which is one of the most basic measures, statistical measures. It's simply the ratio. The odds is a ratio of two probabilities. Probability, in this case, probability of switching to probability of retaining party affiliations, right? And those ratios are simply comparable and multiplicative coefficients that are very convenient in terms of interpretation. And what you see is that actually there is some, after adding the individual characteristics, there is some change in those coefficients pertaining to certain periods, but they are still much less significant than those observed for individual politicians. First of all, if you look at demographics, then the more prone to switching were men and young people, which actually means that young men are more prone to taking risks. So this is basically very intuitive observations. Both women and older people were much loyal in their political choices. The experience on political scene is significantly connected to party switching as well. And what is interesting, having a high occupational position also encourages politicians to switch parties. So if you have your own resources, then by all probability, and this is highly significant, you will be more probable to switch parties because you have like your own capital, your own resources, or you have the high position. But what is more important, most important here, we have the highest coefficients for running in single mandate districts, which means that the electoral system itself is the factor that most strongly induces people to choose another affiliation, right? To move from one party on one list to another. while winning a mandate is not significant statistically significant in this context. You can also take into account the so-called random effects. Perhaps if you'll be interested in why I'm doing this, I will be glad to explain, but I will skip it at the moment. This is simply a way to check if there are some individual traits that are connected with being prone to switching affiliation that I do not measure here. But what is important with the random effects added, the coefficients for single mandate districts are still, and they are even more pronounced. I've run the same analysis only for the mixed system elections. The results are basically the same, and I did it also for only MPs, so only for members of parliament, not the whole political class. But as you can see, the result is pretty much the same. One can also doubt whether the same effect would be held if I, for example, take into account the certain affiliation involved in starting an election. For example, someone may say the result came as a fact of being an independent is mostly correlated with running in SMD. So, but if we put those two variables at once in the model, the result is even stronger. Here you have an odds ratio of more than 3. The result holds also if you look only on one election, which was very interesting in terms of rules, because in 1998 it was a mixed system, but every candidate could run parallelly in proportional system on the national party lists and at the same time in majoritarian system. And if you look only at those elections where people were either running in SMD's party list, on party lists or in both, the effects are consistent with what I have observed in other for all the election and in other framing of this analysis. So there are 4 basic findings in my results. First of all, there is no clear indication that popular upheavals or revolutions brought a lot of change to the political class in terms of heightened dropping out of switching parties. There was obviously some rebranding, but the attachment to certain groups was pretty much the same. One can wonder whether this lack of effect was connected with the fact that in the periods of heightened political conflict, some of the politicians cling very hard to their parties, but in fact you'd expect that this effect would be even higher for the last elections than it was for the elections in 2006, but it is not the case. So we have a not clear situation on that point. A third conclusion would be that what we see in the data is that people that have a lot of resources, that have strong position in the political bargain, in the assortment of individuals and parties, are more prone to switching the affiliation. Which means if you have money or if you have power, then you are the chooser. You choose the party and party doesn't choose you. And in Ukraine is in large degree the case. I mean, the high amount of political and financial resources of individual politicians make the party scene more fluid, with all the other factors held constant. And what we did observe in this data and is most striking, is the electoral system, the electoral institutions that have the strongest impact of what is going on in the political class in Ukraine. So basically, this is the technical university, and you can think about this as institutional or constitutional engineering. In a way, you can try to answer the question whether the laws and the rules of elections that we shape influence how the politics works, and we have the very vivid proof that this is the case. In large degree, choosing your electoral system shapes what do politicians do, what are their decisions in many other contexts. So there is a lot of implications for accountability which are contradictory to the classical theory. First of all, you have to say, and this is one of the last things that I'm pointing out in my presentation, that it's not always the case, as the classical theory tells you, that majoritarian system with people competing in single mandate districts that is better for accountability. In fact, in many countries, this is worse for accountability because as a result of mixed or majoritarian elections, you have more fluidity of parties on the party scene, and this makes the parties as a vessel much less accountable for what they vote on. And the second thing is that this is important to choose electoral system for the political context in a country, in a particular country, and you find a lot of mixed systems and majoritarian systems in federal countries. Ukraine formally is a unitary country. If you have an electoral system that encourages people to seek the personal vote in your district, then it lowers the national cohesion. Some researchers go as far as to say that in Ukraine you don't, for the most of the independence period, you didn't have one political scene, national political scene, but you have several political scenes in different regions of the country. This is there are at least few papers that state that. And for example, Boxler shows that the partisan nationalization in Ukraine is particularly low. So in fact, in the context of Ukrainian transition, if someone would say that having one national political scene is very important, then having both mixed or single mandate district elections is it's an incentive to have those very fragmented political scene, which, well, in many respects is not very, I would say, convenient trait of the political system in this situation. So you can also think about separatism in different countries in terms of what are the electoral rules applied by the national assemblies. So thanks a lot. This is all I will present today. I hope that it wasn't too long, and I await your questions because I'm very interested in any feedback that you can give me or any questions that you have.
Thank you. Thank you for your brilliant presentation. It's been really interesting, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions. Can I answer a couple of questions? My first question perhaps goes a little bit beyond the framework of your presentation, and it deals with kind of an overarching cause of this fluidity. Can it be contributed to the peculiarity of political culture, the lack of influential ideologies, or rather the lack of commitments to political ideologies? And my second question, which is connected to the first one, how does Ukrainian political system and Ukrainian political class fare in comparative perspective within, let's say, European system?
Yeah. Well, first of all, one has to wonder what is a cause and what is result. I mean, you say that there are, for example, there is a problem with the consistent ideologies and with consistent representation. And this influences how much people change their parties. But I would argue that if you search for causes and results, the cause lies always at the side of institutions, because it is institution that you can change relatively easily. The culture, to change the culture, it takes like sometimes centuries. So, well, even if in pragmatic terms, it is more important to look closely at what the effects of certain institutional arrangements are on politics. And if you look at the results of SMDs, of single mandate districts, they actually lower the amount of coherent ideologies that you have in politics, because people running in certain cities, for example, or regions, they will promise people that they will, for example, build a hospital or make the transport system better, but they won't engage so quickly in some ideology. So this makes actually the representation system much less coherent and much less nationalized. So this is pragmatically one thing. And as for comparing Ukrainian system with other countries, you have mixed electoral system in Germany, for example. But Germany has different party systems in regions. For example, you have CDU, CSU. Like this is a strict cooperation, but these are two distinct parties. And you have to remember that states like Germany or United States are in fact federations. Ukraine, at least formally, is not a federation of states. It's a unitary state, so the situation is much different. And obviously, the institutional traditions have a very important role here. In the stable systems like in United States or Germany, having a single mandate districts elections, I would say it's not that risky, because you have a lot of other institutional arrangements that make politics much more coherent and much more, I would say, robust in terms of informal influence. In Central and Eastern Europe, there is a lot of politicians like to play a lot with institutions. They change them according to their views. But if you look at Central and Eastern Europe solely, then you will see that countries that were a part of Soviet Union, they much more often choose a majoritarian system, while the countries in Central Europe, like Poland, Hungary, and so on, and the Czech Republic, they much often choose proportional voting system. There is also much difference between proportional vote with open list and with closed list. So, for example, in Ukraine, even if you have proportional elections, there are closed lists which make the leaders of the party much more of a chooser in this situation. So it makes it changes situation a lot, also in comparison to the open list systems. That's why I would prefer the comparisons that are focused more on the maybe Central Europe and the space of the former Soviet Union than comparing Central European countries to Western Europe. That makes a lot less sense in my opinion.
Okay, thank you, Mikołaj. And while you are going to the mic, я хочу привітати наших друзів і колег з Білорусі, які приєдналися до нас. Вони не просто друзі і колеги, але також і партнери у нашому спільному дослідницькому проєкті, який фінансується з боку відповідних українського державного і білоруського державного фондів фундаментальних наук. Так що вітаємо. Миколай.
Thank you, Professor Sadowski, for a very insightful presentation in which, again, you delivered us some evidence that institutions matters. But I have some, let's say, fundamental question, because you start...
Can you speak up?
Yeah, I have fundamental question for your presentation, because you started with quoting Coleman and saying that you're not interested in researching on what's on surface, and that's why you didn't feel like researching politics on the level of parties, rather on the level of individual politicians. But actually my question is, in case of Ukraine, is it the right level? Isn't in fact the ones who are social actors here are some groups of interests surrounded around oligarchs or other kind of groupings who are having real agency, and individual politicians as well as parties are just epiphenomena of this game of interests? How would you be able to methodologically include it into your statistical models, this kind of variables?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Pawlak, for this question, which is very interesting, though. I would say, well, not very valid in the context of the analysis that I've actually done, because you'd want me to, for example, code which politician is a proxy of which oligarch, which, well, maybe someone has a courage to validly try to affiliate a certain politician with certain like business group or something like that. But first of all, I would say that such an analysis, there would be a lot of doubt about validity of such an analysis. But you should think about what this analysis was really about. It was my aim was to show where lies the key mechanism of easily manipulating the politics. In a way, you have to look at the gates which allow some processes to enter the parliamentary politics, not at individual cases of, let's say, corrupt politicians or something like that. So I would prefer to focus on mechanisms, not on certain instances of influence of business on politics. Well, you have influence of business on politics everywhere, in every country. But in some cases, the institutional doors are more opened or more closed to this manipulation, let's say, right? To this influence. And you can think about this in like a triangle. You have influence groups, you have individual politicians, and you have parties. If the individual politicians are empowered, then they think about what brings them more benefit, being affiliated with a party or being affiliated with a group which brings resources, because in this context, resources means I'm able to choose party, I'm able to easily win the elections, and so on and so on. So if you are more dependent of your, let's say, political sponsors, but not the formal political parties, then the parties in this triangle become very weak, and hence the ideologies are much less represented, and the actually popular interests are much less represented. What is more represented is interests of particular interest groups, right? So I would focus on mechanism more in this case.
Wojciech?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. I don't really have a question. I have some remarks regarding the presentation and its content. First of all, one like ad vocem thing, a very small thing. You said that about comparing Ukraine with Germany, and that the difference is about being federal and unitary. I think the difference is primarily because the mixed system in Ukraine and mixed system in Germany are totally different systems. Because this is a different mixed system. It's like a personalized proportional system in Germany. So I would say that this is the main issue. But that's just a small remark. But when it comes to the presentation itself, I found it very interesting in terms what are the data, what are the data, and what are the results. I think they're very interesting and profound. What was missing from the presentation was the actual hypothesis and the justification, a theoretical background for the hypothesis. This is what I was missing, because you showed us the data, we went through it, and then you jumped into the results, which well, there were some hypotheses hidden in the presentation of the results, but even though I could like imagine what were these hypotheses, there was the theoretical background was missing. So if this presentation will be transformed into a paper, you would need to like add these hypotheses and get the grounding of for them. That I think it would be totally necessary.
Yeah, thanks a lot. In fact, there is a widely described model of interactions between individuals and politicians in the paper, but I didn't want to give you the tedious detail. I call it a bargain and mutual assortment between individuals and parties. And this is in line with a lot of research on intra-party politics. So, in fact, yeah, I haven't elaborated on that, but the hypotheses were, and it's maybe worth repeating it, first of all, that I was expecting some effects of revolution. This is first hypothesis, that there will be effects of revolutions on party switching and dropping out, and I haven't seen that. And the second hypothesis was that, and it stemmed in a large degree from the accountability theory, that if you think about SMD as producing a lot of accountability, then party switching undermines it. And the recent literature, and this is a base of my hypothesis, is that people can try to avoid accountability, responsibility for the politics by simply, when they see one political vessel sinking, then try to jump to another political vessels and try to change the party colors. Well, in a way, this was visible here, but the most striking result was that of party switching, and here actually literature is mixed. In some countries, if you have PRL elections, there is a lot of switching. In some other countries, in majoritarian system, induces a lot of switching. In this case, this is very clear. If you run as a candidate in single mandate district, you are much more prone to switch in both cases if you begin in SMD or if you end as a SMD candidate. So this system works in at both time moments. Yeah, thanks for those remarks. Yeah, obviously these are very important issues. I would very welcome any comments or questions from Ukrainian scholars, because for now I got mostly the Polish comments and questions. Perhaps some of the Ukrainian scientists or students are interested in politics in Ukraine.
I'm not Ukrainian.
Well, you can apply for Ukrainian citizenship.
Yeah, I'll ask a very simple and ignorant question that maybe will prompt others. I know that in Poland, the party system is not a simple left-right continuum, but is very complicated. How does that compare with Ukraine? You presented your results pro forma as a left-right continuum, but is there such a thing here, or is it much more complicated? And might that have implications for switching?
Well, that's why I didn't approach the topic with the notions of left and right as a variables that are well defined and introduced into analysis. In both countries, being left and right party doesn't mean a lot. You can be a leftist party in terms of economics and at the same time rightist party in terms of, let's say, morals and religion and some things like that. Also, the large difference between those cases is that Poland have there were some changes, obviously, in electoral system, but you have mostly the same electoral system throughout the time, which means that I cannot introduce it as a variable because it's basically a constant, right? And political systems, they both evolve in large degree, and you have switches between parties in both cases, right? So the biggest difference actually is the electoral system. Is the electoral system, and one may say, well, there is a wider political culture, but that is maybe different. But well, I'm skeptical about trying to code it and introduce it into a model. This is a kind of assumption, and I'm much fond of studying national cases because you can treat those cases as those where cultural differences are held constant, while in international comparative analysis, and there are good examples of that, you try to measure, for example, effects of institutional arrangements, and you discover that, for example, proportional electoral system together with presidentialism produces a lot of corruption. But at the same time, the presidentialism and proportional system is dominant kind of organization of state in Latin America. So you cannot say if this is really the effect of institutional system or Latin political culture. So in the end, doing the analysis in one nation when you have some variables like switching of electoral system, well, that makes a lot of sense in terms of control of other factors.
Thank you a lot for your great presentation, but I have a little question. I'm very interested in your logistic model, and I would like to look at it in more details, maybe after the conference. Maybe you have a paper with the results. But my question is about, did you look at the actors, at the politician, like the individuals, or maybe you had the variable in your logistic model, some group process? Maybe there were some process of groups of politicians who changed the party. Did you had some variables like this? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, actually, as I've said in the introduction, when there was a large group of politicians from one party going to another, it was rather a party split. I've treated this like a party split. For example, when there was a bloc za Jedinu Ukrainu, and when politicians from that bloc went both to Lithuanian bloc and Party of Regions, then you'd have to decide which one of them were like continuing their career in the same group and which were switching. In this case, it would be an arbitrary decision in my view. That's why I've decided that I will treat it as simply a party split, because the whole group from this party went to another vessels, so I didn't treat it as an individual switch. Thank you, this was a very good question indeed.
Thank you very much indeed for your presentations, very interesting. And actually I have a couple of comments and questions as a follow-up of my comments. First of all, when you treat all politicians, all those candidates which took part in different kinds of elections, right? You consider them as equal. Each of them just one unity, right? But we know that all these politicians are very different in terms of, first of all, of their political influence, of their positions, official and unofficial, because we know that there are different informal rules, especially in Ukrainian politics. And in this case, I suppose that considering all of them equally in terms of their participation and influence and so on, makes this kind of analysis a bit artificial. And it gives not those results which we are expecting to have, actually, as an outcome of our result. I suppose that in this case you can actually make some kind of additional variables which can consider the level of influence of these politicians. Because in case of this equal approach, as we know in this positivist sociology, we rarely consider each respondent as equal to another one. In this case, we actually overlook these important differences. I suppose, for example, you can include additional variables like the level of influence of politicians. For example, leaders of political parties or influential deputies and stuff like this in your analysis. What do you think about this?
Well,
and second question, actually, I was wondering why actually your results didn't show some qualitative changes, some radical changes, for example, in the level of entering into politics and dropping out from the politics of some politicians in periods of these revolutionary upheavals. And probably it's also connected with this lack of, this qualitative component in your analysis. Because qualitatively, in terms of analysis of political process in Ukraine, we know that despite all this continuity in clan-like politics, oligarchic influences and stuff like this, the last Verkhovna Rada, the last parliament of Ukraine, is not radically, but quite substantially different from the previous one. Because we know that some new political forces appeared in the parliament, some new politicians, and even new types of politicians are evidently in new parliament. And using this kind of analysis, all these peculiarities cannot be identified.
Thank you for those two very, very valid and interesting questions. First of all, as for the results of the recent elections, we have to wait until the next elections to see what are the long-term effects. This is the first fact. But if we simply look at what happens between 2020 and 2014, then at least in terms of the general dropping out and switching, it was not as high as one would expect. You suggested that I should add variable that is a proxy measure for having an influence. I've tried to do it by using at least 3 or 4 variables here. The proxy measure for influence first is having managerial position. It was self-defined by a politician running in a election, so the Central Electoral Commission gave us this data on what is the occupation. If someone was self-defined manager or self-defined official, this was a first proxy variable for the resources or influences that person have. Second variable was whether he was an MP before that or not. If someone is influential, then he is more able to win the mandate 2 times in a row. Third variable was whether this person, how many times in the past he tried to win the mandate. So this shows if someone stays in politics and can afford to run in like 5 consecutive elections, this shows that this person has some kind of resources or influences because he's able to stay in this competition. It's like in market competition. You have to have some capital to stay in the competition. So you are basically right that this is very important to precisely try to pinpoint the influence of each individual politician. But I'm trying to do it not in an arbitrary way, that's saying that this is influential person in my opinion. For example, most of the party leaders were obviously re-elected, they were obviously have long history of running, and there were obviously previously MPs. So I had them like coded by 3 variables. And what is very important, all those variables were significantly correlated with switching, which means that if you have more influence, more power, then you are more of a chooser in politics, that you decide which side to be with, and if you don't like it at some moment you go with another party or simply run as an independent. Yeah. Thanks. I think that's mostly all.
I have one more question. Yeah, thanks for your brilliant answers, but I have one more question. In one of your answers, you mentioned the notion of presidentialism. Yeah. And my question is as follows. I'm sure you've noticed that the Ukrainian political system has been oscillating between some sort of presidentialism and parliamentary presidential arrangement. Right now, in terms of constitutional arrangement or constitutional engineering, we are a parliamentary presidential republic. Nevertheless, I think there are all signs that the presidential authority, presidential power and presidential powers are being consolidated with no amendments to constitution and constitutional engineering inside. So how would you evaluate these developments, and what is your kind of forecast for this evolution? Are we going de facto, if not de jure, towards some sort of president-centered system, despite the lack of relevant institutional and constitutional arrangements?
Well, I'm very sorry, but it will be very hard for me to answer that question because my research wasn't on presidentialism. So we can try to have an educated guess on what will happen, but in this respect, I think that you have more information and more data on that. So I'm not able to address the question whether you are going into more presidential system or less presidential system. I can only say that in some respect presidentialism is more convenient and in some other respect less convenient. For example, in the United States, presidentialism is pretty convenient for waging wars because president cannot do a lot of things internally, but he's a commander-in-chief and has a lot to say in terms of waging wars. So if you are considering if it's convenient to have presidentiality if you wage war, then this is one question. If you are thinking about, for example, having good political representation, then it's not, obviously, because as lately some elections showed in France and the United States, you can have accidental president. That there is a lot of chance in choosing only one representative. So in that matter, it's much worse. I've consumed a lot of time, so thanks a lot.
Thank you.